Hello students, and welcome to the hybrid day that we're dedicating to Jorge Luis Borges and his story, The Garden of Forking Paths. I think this is a story that you'll really enjoy. It's one of my favorites, and I think it's just a lot of fun. A lot of times people will call Borges a playful postmodernist. He's somebody who's willing to take a literary experiment to its logical extreme. So for instance, you might be familiar with the idea that words only have meaning in context. You know, we shouldn't lift half a sentence out of a letter someone has written and claim that we can understand what it means. Well, Borges takes that idea and runs with it in a piece called Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote. It's a piece that appeared alongside the one we're reading in the collection called The Garden of Forking Paths, and it's presented as a piece of literary criticism in which a fictional reviewer created by Borges reviews the work of Pierre Menard, who is a fictional translator of Don Quixote. The fictional reviewer considers Menard's Quixote, which is word for word identical with the original. Even though it's exactly like the original, he considers it to be much richer in allusion than the original work, because Menard's must be considered in light of world events since 1602, the date of the Quixote's original publication. That's a text where Borges takes the idea that meaning is determined by context and pushes it to its limits. It's an intellectual enjoyment that he offers us, and he was a real hit with experimental writers in Europe, such as Alain Robbe-Grillet, who we'll read tomorrow. Borges was Argentinian. He published some of his best-known work in the 1940s. He's known today as one who played with time, infinity, mirrors, and labyrinths, as you'll see today. If you enjoy films like 12 Monkeys, Fight Club, or Inception, you're bound to get a kick out of this story. Okay, our literary concepts. Mimesis all over again, and the return of genre. We're going to talk about both these here in a second. So I'm calling this mimesis all over again because mimesis assumes a hard line between representation and what's represented. This is what we talked about in class on Monday, about that speculum mundi idea. At its heart, Borges' brand of playful postmodernism has a refusal to separate being and being about. And what I mean is that instead of producing a story about a labyrinth, Borges wants to produce a story that is itself a labyrinth. It's kind of like the idea of a coffee table book about coffee tables, which is itself a coffee table. So Borges' stories are kind of like a drawing by M.C. Escher, where the narrative voice is often lost in the world that it's called into creation. And we're often asked to understand that world as our own and as alien at the same time. Keeping these stories anchored is Borges' use of genre. We talked about genre in the widest possible sense at the beginning of the semester. Now we'll think of it much more narrowly. As you read The Garden of Forking Paths, you'll probably recognize many elements of a spy thriller. This is an important part of the joy of reading Borges. At the same time, this story is a meditation on the nature of time, reality, and repetition, and a narrative representation of hypertext, or the many worlds interpretation of quantum physics. It's also a great spy story. It works on both those levels equally well, which points us toward another important element of postmodern literature. It's not concerned with distinguishing between high and low art. For writers like Borges, there's no conflict raised by incorporating your philosophical ideas into a piece of genre fiction, like a spy story. Moving on to historical contexts. It should not be a surprise that, given Borges' tendency to jump across boundaries, he thinks of history not just as context, but as itself a text. So let's look at the very first paragraph of The Garden of Forking Paths. It says, on page 22 of Liddell Hart's History of World War I, you will read that an attack against the Serre-Montauban line by 13 British divisions, supported by 1,400 artillery pieces, planned for the 24th of July 1916, had to be postponed until the morning of the 29th. The torrential rains, Captain Liddell Hart comments, caused this delay, an insignificant one to be sure. Our starting point is textual. We're starting with a reference to this very authoritative work on the history of the First World War. This is typical, the next paragraph immediately calls into question that official history. And so we get this. The following statement, dictated, reread, and signed by Dr. Yu Tsun, former professor of English at the Hochschule in Tsingtao, throws an unsuspected light over the whole affair. The first 2 pages of the document are missing. This is typical of the playful postmodern approach to history. We might say that Borges is interested in a micro-historical approach instead of the kind of big history that Liddell Hart writes. This is history as what wasn't recorded, history as what was missed. It's a history in which alternative possibilities coexist, as you'll see in the story. I would just like to point out that the story starts with this questioning of history, which is also a questioning of the line between reality and fiction, which is made possible by the fact that we're dealing with a labyrinth of texts rather than with solid fact. That's why it's crucial that we don't actually have Yu Tsun narrating his story for us. Rather, we have a typescript of what he has dictated, reread, and signed. You should consider as you read why we're giving this document with its first 2 pages missing. From the very beginning of the text, we are thrown into a world where we can't separate history from fiction, and where text points to text in what will finally be a maze of possibilities. If modernists were terrified by history, and trying to find a way to suffer less from it, postmodernists like Borges are partying on history's grave, enjoying the 4th stage of the sign, when words and images are free to refer to one another without concern for connecting with reality. So our close reading passage. The question is, the term is going to be diegesis of the world of the text, and then beyond mimesis once more. What kind of reality are we working with in this text? Well, often we might say that a fictional text creates a diegetic world. That's the world of the story, and we expect it to have certain rules. So, for instance, a show like CSI makes a deal with its viewers that really strange things will happen on the show, but there will never be something totally incomprehensible in its diegetic world. Ultimately, the world of CSI is the world of detectives and explanations, not unlike Scooby-Doo. The point is, it's very consistent, and if this were a multimedia class, we could look closely at the show to see how it establishes that consistency. What is the diegetic world of the Garden of Forking Paths like? Well, on one hand, it's a spy story, so it needs certain rules. Yu Tsun is trying to get the name of the town that should be bombed out to his German handlers. He can't do that through telepathy or something. There's no magic that will let us off the hook in this story. However, at the same time, the diegetic world of the book is not as rigid as all that. Let's look at a passage to get a sense of how exactly the diegesis drifts off towards something much stranger than the world of a spy novel. So this is the last paragraph on page 2416, if you have those page numbers. So we start solidly in the world of the spy story. Let's look at these first 2 sentences. For an instant, I thought that Richard Madden in some way had penetrated my desperate plan. Very quickly, I understood that was impossible. So that's pure spy story stuff. Sentences 3 and 4 take us from this world to labyrinths and to Yu Tsun's heritage, his great-grandfather. So we get the instructions to turn always to the left reminded me that such was the common procedure for discovering the central point in certain labyrinths. I have some understanding of labyrinths. Not for nothing am I the great-grandson of that Sui Pen, who was governor of Yunnan, and who renounced worldly power in order to write a novel that might be even more populous than the Hong Lo Meng, and to construct a labyrinth in which all men would become lost. So suddenly we're in a different place here. From here on, Yu Tsun's powers of contemplation lead him ever further away from the world of the story. So, I'm not going to read the whole paragraph to you, but you can see that he goes on this kind of like trip in his mind. But let's look and see what happens by the end of the paragraph. He's walked out of England and into the place he was imagining. The links were purely associative, the kind of links that we can make because we use symbols. The idea of this paragraph is not to present reality like a mirror, but to create a reality that transcends all of that. So what's the takeaway here? Borges uses language itself to lead us out of the world he's created, a world we think we recognize, and into a strange world where mental associations become physical places, So by the end of this paragraph, he's actually going to this Chinese location with the sparkling music. That's one of the clearest representations I know of using language to create a non-representational reality. We are a million miles from Aristotle and the imitation of action here. So Borges is using language to do something really different in this paragraph. So moving on to things to keep in mind as you read. How else does language create the world, or at least affect the world in this story? That's a question you might start from. You might be thinking about different ways that different kinds of language shape this world. What's the editor's role in the story? So just to add another level of complexity, we get a footnote from an editor who comments on Yu Tsun's story, and he comments in a pretty piquant manner. So why should that be included? Why do we need that editor? So those are some things I want you to think about. I want you to enter this labyrinth and figure out how exactly language is being used to do something besides just imitate reality.